I want to welcome everybody to tonight's 2021 virtual Luther lecture. This is a little unusual, certainly the most unusual Luther lecture I've attended, and certainly everyone else has. And we are very honored and excited tonight to hear from our guest speaker, Dr. Azza Karam. My name is Dr. Noel Chevalier. I teach English here at Luther College at the University of Regina, and I'm going to be moderating, hosting, keeping things on track for the evening, but you're not going to hear that much from me. But I do want to start off by saying that although we are not all of us in the same physical location, Luther College is based on Treaty 4 land, which is the original homelands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota peoples, and the homeland of the Métis. So this is where we strive to honor and transform our relationships with one another. Tonight's lecture will, all told, take about an hour or so. We will hear Dr. Karam's lecture. There will be time for questions afterwards, and I want to do a little housekeeping to explain how that's going to work. You will not be able to turn on your cameras or microphones, so you won't be able to ask questions directly, but there is a chat feature, and so we ask that everyone who wants to ask a question can submit a question via the chat feature, and I will read out the questions as I receive them to Dr. Karam for the amount of time that we have. So we do welcome questions. We hope that we can get some discussion going in that format, but we won't quite get the kind of dialogue going that we sometimes have. So with that, I also want to mention that if you want simply to see Dr. Karam's box exclusively in the upper right corner, there's a thing labeled View, My View. You can click on Speaker, and that will expand her box to fill most of your screen, and you can focus on her there. So with that, I'm going to call upon Reverend Dr. Mark Jerry, President of Luther College, to bring greetings from Luther.
Good evening, friends. Thank you, Dr. Chevalier. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us virtually tonight and bring greetings on behalf of Luther College. We are excited to finally offer this lecture once again, even if it still has to be digital due to the pandemic. We've had over 150 participants register with us tonight from all over North America. In attendance tonight, we have Board of Regents members, including our board chair, Mr. Greg Swanson, some past Luther College presidents, Dr. Don Lee, Dr. Brian Hillis, and our federated college partner at Campion College, their president, Dr. Sammy Halawa. We have lots of current and former faculty members, church members, alumni, donors, and friends, and many members of the community who are here tonight. We are grateful that you are here to join us. I need to say a word of thanks also to our Luther Lecture Committee for organizing this year's event. As you can imagine, trying to come up with a digital version turned out to be quite a bit more complicated than a traditional event. I'd like to thank the committee members, Dr. Yvonne Petrie, Dr. Volker Greffenhagen, Angela Bethune, Justine Esplin, and of course, Dr. Noel Chevalier and Michelle Clark. And so we are grateful to the hard work the committee put together to create this event. This lecture is an important event in Luther's community that dates back to 1977 when it was established. The Luther Lecture allows our college to make a distinctive contribution to the life of the university and to our general community on matters of spiritual and social importance. This year is no exception as we welcome Dr. Curran as our guest lecturer. We'd also like to thank and acknowledge the generous financial support of the Canadian Lutheran World Relief, Faith Life Financial, and the James Kurtz Memorial Trust Fund. Without this support, we would not be able to bring you the event. We have with us also tonight the Executive Director of the Canadian Lutheran World Relief, the Reverend Dr. Curran Achtelstetter. Dr. Curran will be introducing our lecturer tonight. Curran, over to you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Mark Jerry. It's actually so wonderful to join you all tonight. Thank you for that opportunity. And I would like to begin by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let me acknowledge that I'm joining you by Zoom from my office in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Let us acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and commit ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And this is really a very eventful week for us at CLWR. Yesterday, we celebrated Canadian Lutheran World Relief's 75th anniversary. And today I have the great honor and privilege to introduce to you Professor Dr. Azza Karam, the Secretary General of Religions for Peace. RFP is a global multi-religious movement with 92 national and 6 regional interreligious councils. Azza and I met almost a decade ago when Azza was the coordinator of the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Religion and Development, and she was the senior advisor on culture at the United Nations Population Fund. And these were really exciting years. Azza was instrumental in the creation of the International Partnership for Religion and Development. She organized workshops with the objective to engage relief and development agencies from different religious backgrounds in dialogue and planning. And she challenged us. She challenged us that we should think more about how we can work together in the future and how we can make a difference together, and how we always have to acknowledge that we work with people of faith. She reminded us agencies and UN organizations that the people, the communities whom we serve in our relief projects and developments, that the programs, that these people were people of faith and that their faith and values needed to be respected and had to be taken into account in the implementation of our projects and programs. Azza is truly a citizen of the world. Born in Egypt, she resides in the United States, and she is a citizen of the Netherlands, where she is a professor of religion and development at the Free University in Amsterdam. When Religions for Peace in 2019 elected Azza as Secretary General, I celebrated this election together with many, many others around the world. There couldn't have been a better choice. In her PhD dissertation, Azza focused on political Islam. Azza's numerous publications focus on international political dynamics, including democratization, human rights, peace and security, gender, religious engagement, and sustainable development. Tonight, Professor Karam will speak about a topic that continues to have a great impact on our society and our faith communities. Religions in the pandemic. Sobering or hopeful is the title of her lecture. We are so pleased to have you here tonight. Professor Karam, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Reverend Dr. Curran Achterstelzer, for this lovely introduction. I was at some point wondering who you were talking about, but it really is very nice of you to introduce me so nicely. I am deeply grateful to you. And I just want to begin by saying that I would like to honor the Native Americans of this land that I'm in. I'm in Westchester County in New York. There's only one slight issue, is I cannot pronounce the name properly. It's a rather complicated name, but I've put it in the chat box. If anyone can pronounce that, please be my guest. In the meantime, I understand that this was the community of Wappinger Indians, and actually some of them were rooted out and sent and had to go and join the Algonquin. So they came to where you are, Reverend Dr. Curran. So it looks like this is the space, the land that belonged to the same communities. And I just wish to honor that as I begin. There is also the very traditional greeting from my Muslim community, which is to say, Salam alaikum and peace be upon you all. I was planning, and I guess I should probably also just thank you very much, Luther College at the University of Regina. Obviously, you've noted Dr. Yvonne Petri, Dr. Noel Chevalier, and obviously your sponsors for today's program. This I was sharing earlier is one of the longest planned lectures I've committed to. We started in 2019. And I am absolutely grateful to God and delighted, and thanks to all of you for the opportunity to be able to actually have this conversation with you. As Reverend Dr. Curran mentioned, the theme is religions in the pandemic, sobering or hopeful. And Reverend Dr. Curran made a very good synopsis of religions for peace. Allow me to add just a wee little bit to it, to what Curran shared. So, as you know, the United Nations is 193 governments or political institutions. Religions for Peace is 100 religious institutions and faith communities from around the world. So every religious leader or faith leader on my board represents and is formally elected to sit on this board by their respective religious institution. And where there is not a religious institution, as is the case, by the way, for the majority of the world's religions, then the person is nominated, elected, and appointed by their community, their faith community. So just as the United Nations has 193 members in its General Assembly, we have 100 religious institutions and leaders in our General Assembly. And we work through interreligious councils in, as Curran mentioned, over 100 countries, actually, and 6 regions of the world. So what do these interreligious councils do? Basically, you have a representation from the faith communities, not just religious institutions, but the faith communities who sit on the council. Depending on the country that they are in, they will work on different issues that are pertinent to the country. Some of them are humanitarian actors. Many of them are doing development projects, education, health, sanitation, nutrition. Many of them are mediators, negotiators in conflict situations where that is the case. And many are also working on a number of different interreligious educational work. What makes them special, if you will, is that they work together. So not only within their religious communities and the religious institutions, religious NGOs, but they actually work together. Now, allow me to share just a few pointers about the pandemic, COVID pandemic that we have today in general. And then I will, my presentation will be divided into 2 segments. The first is just to elaborate a little bit more as concretely as possible on what does religion have to do with it? And what do I mean by religion? How do religions work in this space? And then the second part of my presentation will focus on, you know, for lack of a better word, the more sobering aspect. So the first part of the presentation is going to be the hopeful, and the latter part will be still hopeful, but a little bit of the sobering alongside. So just in terms of the pandemic trajectory, we know that high vaccination countries like the United States, Canada, much of the European Union, the prediction is that they're likely to see new cases peak late in the 3rd quarter or early in the 4th quarter of 2021. As cases decline, these countries could start transition towards normalcy as early as the 4th quarter of 2021. Now, this was predicted approximately 3.5 months ago. And it was predicted based on the fact that the vaccines that are used in these countries would continue to be effective at preventing severe cases of COVID-19. What we're beginning to see today is that as a result of the fact that there are still pockets of resistance to the vaccine, and as a result of the fact that the rest of the world has not got the access to the vaccines, and therefore we are seeing new mutations take place, the prediction now is a setback to this business of getting back to normalcy. So we understand that most low-income, and since most low-income, middle-income countries have not yet gained access to enough vaccines, the overall immunity that we're talking about for some kind of normal remains low enough. So indeed, we are facing a significant risk of waves of this disease. So therefore, more likely to take until late 2022 or early 2023 for these countries to achieve high vaccine coverage. And we don't know when the time for these countries to manage COVID-19 as an endemic disease will actually take place. We really cannot predict that in any way, shape, or form. This, at least, is what we understand from the WHO, the World Health Organizations, and others. So what has religion got to do with all this? And what do I mean when I speak about religion? Because we know that religions can refer to practically everything under the sun. If 8 out of 10 people around the world identify themselves as religious in some way, shape, or form, or identify themselves with one religion, when we speak about religion, we're talking about a pretty significant swath of human population. So what on earth am I actually referring to? When I speak of religions, I'm thinking of religious leaders, religious institutions like mosques, churches, synagogues, temples, etc. Religious NGOs, non-governmental organizations who are in the lead on issues of humanitarian and development assistance around the world. Curran is a brilliant example into the Lutheran World Federation and that community. So it's actually quite a diverse group when we talk about religion. We're not just referring to people of faith, like myself, like others, but we're talking about institutions that are very long, the oldest institutions known to humankind, in fact, long before we had governments and the European Union and the United Nations, and long before that, we've always actually had churches and mosques and synagogues and temples. So they're the oldest institutions known to humankind. So I'm referring to this swath of reality, if you will. Now, so what's that got to do with the pandemic? Well, we know, in fact, that there are at least 7 reasons. I like to think that in the Holy Quran, it talks about the 7 heavens. I don't quite know why, but there's a 7 heavens. So I think 7 reasons for why and where religions intersect with our daily lives, and particularly with aspects relevant to this pandemic. We know, number one, we know that religions and religious institutions, religious leaders in particular, religious actors, are actually social and cultural gatekeepers in most societies. It's really only in Western Europe that the idea of, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and render to whatever God, what is God, that really, really only took kind of root in Western Europe. I've been living in the United States now for almost over 20 years. I honestly don't think it's a very secular society. The last I heard, there was a very powerful several series of religious blocks that have very, very strong implications on elections in this country, political elections. So yeah, really, in truth, we're talking about, in most cases, religious actors in their diversity serving as effectively cultural and social gatekeepers. So when we want to talk about transformations in behaviors, in attitudes, in social and cultural norms, we actually understand that some of the most powerful voices or tendencies or forces of change or blocks against change are these religious leaders, their institutions, where they can actually use their respective pulpits, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, at least, if not Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, according to other religious traditions. Their pulpits are massive, deep-rooted, and very widely spread. So it would be very unlikely, when we're talking about trying to change certain behaviors or attitudes, that if we don't involve some of these religious actors in that space of advocacy and behavioral change, we can only see very limited changes that take place. There's enough studies about the impact on harmful traditional practices like female genital mutilation, early and forced child marriage, and a number of other practices in many societies where the most secular of development actors have come to the realization that they have to recruit, mobilize, use, the terms are very different, the religious actors in order to advance those kinds of behavioral changes that are required. Here in the United States, there's even Gallup data and plenty of research that shows that, religious Americans are, in a sense, also able and working through religion and religious beliefs to try to cope with the different, the 2008 recession, and now with the pandemic as well. And there's, as I said, there's research to back that up. The second reason is we know that these are the largest, oldest, and most far-reaching social service providers. Health, education, nutrition, sanitation, environmental conservation. The oldest hospitals, hospices, and clinics in the world are actually, were and still are, somehow linked to these different religious institutions. We talk about madrasas in the Muslim context. Well, these are schools that are linked to different mosques and have been there since time immemorial. So we know that that even though today we think in terms of the ICRC or the United Nations this or the European Union that, or the government's ministries of health, of education, we know that the oldest actually institutions that have been catering to what we today call development work, and which is effectively social services, we know that the oldest institutions in this space are actually the religious institutions. In 2012, there was a study in The Economist that showed that over 70% of hospitals in the United States of America are actually managed by or through the Catholic Church. So therefore, plenty of implication not only on that outreach and the way that it can go beyond, but if 70% in hospitals in the United States of America are managed through or by the Catholic Church, can you imagine what the percentage is for Africa, Asia, Latin America, and countries which haven't quite gone that far ahead in terms of the secularization of their social service infrastructure? The third reason we know is because actually at least 4 out of the top 10 global humanitarian organizations, the ones that are most active, at least 4 out of the top 10 are faith-based organizations. I had a delightful aha moment with my United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs colleagues during the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit, when they were looking at the top 10 and the commitments that they were making at the summit, the top 10 humanitarian NGOs. And a voice, mine, went and said, good grief, there's at least four there who are faith-based NGOs. And somebody turned to me and said, what, who? And I said, well, Caritas, Catholic, Lutheran, Islamic Relief, Islamic, World Vision, hello. And it was this moment of, oh, they're faith-based? No, they're just called that. We know that they're, again, in line with being the oldest service providers, are also the oldest humanitarian actors out there. So we also know that in this pandemic, the front line responders have been the faith-based and faith-inspired NGOs. So it's not been a matter of choice. It's simply because they're there already in different countries. You don't have to fly them in. They're there long after those humanitarian actors from abroad come in and leave. The original humanitarian responders are still there and will continue to be there. So, and this isn't just a feature of what's going on in the Western Hemisphere. This is very much the reality in most of the world. So we know that there are plenty of studies that show that whether it's in India or South Africa or Peru or Chile or Malaysia or Singapore even, we're talking about contexts where religious communities and religious NGOs are on the front line, working now very much alongside those government run entities to serve the communities, because the needs are way higher. They're not limited to anyone, as the virus doesn't seem to distinguish between anyone. So therefore the needs are quite high, and the lockdowns that had to be imposed in many parts of the world necessitated all hands on deck, so to speak. So we also know that we have the fourth reason, which is, quite frankly, that these religious actors, many of them are heavily vested in and with politicians, political parties. Many of them are actually pretty much engaged in politics in some way, shape, or form. So I'm not talking about the Gulf. I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia and Iran. I'm talking about the rest of the world. I'm talking about Russia, Brazil, the United States. We are seeing a confluence and a convergence between the religious actors and the religious spaces and political parties, political actors and political spaces. It seems to have escaped a lot of minds that here in the so-called secular United States, every year there's a so-called prayer breakfast to which everybody needs to pay money to come to the table and meet with the president of the country. And you think prayer breakfast, really? Yes, and everybody wants to come and be at this prayer breakfast, which is a normal thing that happens at least once a year in the United States of America. And you kind of wonder, we don't do prayer breakfast in Egypt with the president of Egypt, as far as I know, but hey, you do it in the United States of America, the so-called secular part of the world. But we all know that it's not. The fifth reason is, interestingly enough, and this we don't hear enough about, but we will be hearing a lot more about in the next few years, that actually in terms of resources, religious institutions and religious NGOs are some of the most creatively self-financed institutions in the world. The people, whether it's the tithe, whether it's the zakat, whether it's just donations from believers, that actually, in spite of everything that gets said about lack of resources here, there, and everywhere, which of course is true, but indeed, even just counting the labor, the human power that is there in volunteers, that religious institutions actually are quite well resourced relative to a lot of other non-governmental organizations. Now, this fact has apparently been picked up on by even the United Nations, which today has in many of its largest entities doing development and humanitarian work have created offices that are now designed to solicit funding from religious communities and institutions. So the pendulum has definitely swung 180 degrees from religious institutions being on the receiving end of any potential assistance from governments or from others, which, by the way, many religious institutions were not. But now religious institutions are beginning to be donors to international development and humanitarian work. That is an incredibly significant shift. So we're thinking of religious NGOs and religious communities who are gathering money to contribute to the United Nations humanitarian and development and relief efforts. Watch that space, please, because there is bound to be some very interesting dynamics there. We usually, non-governmental organizations are on the receiving end of international development assistance. In this case, there is a very definite, we're at the cusp of a movement that is invariably shifting towards religious donors to international humanitarian relief, to the United Nations system. The sixth reasons is, frankly, if we're saying rightly that in some cases, some religious arguments and some religious institutions or leaders are actually behind violence, the legitimation of violence, the acts of terrorism or extremism, negative and harmful messaging, such as we've seen in this pandemic. No, you have to come to do mass in church or do the Jummah prayers or come to the temple, because it's only when you come, regardless of all the health warnings that are out there, God will spare you. God will spare you if you continue to perform your rituals that are absolutely necessary. We do get that. That's still happening. We're now hearing a very definitely increasing wave of those from within religious communities, but frankly also from within the scientific community, who are arguing against vaccines and vaccination with 1,000,001 different kinds of arguments. So if we understand and we know and we point fingers at religious actors who are engaged in that kind of messaging, then how can we possibly walk away from engaging within that space? You can't just put it all aside and say, well, we're just going to ignore these people. They're weird. They're strange. We're just going to ignore them. You can't. You can't ignore them because they're actually impacting on health. They're actually impacting on livelihoods. They're actually impacting on people's lives. So we must engage. These have to be part of our engagement and communications and outreach. At the very minimum, they're on our consciousness horizon. So if they are supposedly the source of harm, that makes it even more necessary to engage with these different kinds of religious actors. We know that here in the United States, for instance, some evangelical pastors are actually providing religious exemption documents to members of their churches and right-wing forums, which are sharing strategies to avoid vaccination requirements. Some religious freedom groups are sending threatening letters to states, schools, and employers, and preparing legal challenges to fight vaccine mandates. Folks, you can't ignore this. We can't look away. So therefore, we must be not only conversant with those kinds of realities, but actually be able to communicate with some of these leaders, or at the very minimum to work within different religious communities to increase the level of awareness of what is going on, and form partnerships and alliances that will, if not obviously eliminate, but diminish the power of that voice in communities because it is harmful. So the same religious reasons sometimes are given to ignore international human rights norms, violate them. So for all of the above reasons, it is incredibly valuable that religious actors are not just engaged, but that we understand that religions matter. And last reason, my seventh heaven, seventh sky, is because, quite frankly, pandemics and humanitarian crises in general, like this one we're living in, which is all over the world, nobody's exempt, and which is happening simultaneously with a whole bunch of other crises. The most noteworthy of them is our environmental crisis. Our very air, the oxygen that we breathe, is endangered. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of the fact that the Amazon forests are the lungs of our earth, the lungs of our earth. They are being decimated at ridiculous rates. And that means that our very lungs of this earth are being decimated. So this environmental crisis, we've seen floods, we've seen earthquakes, and we are unfortunately destined to see more because we have really, truly neglected our environment at best. And we tend to plunder rather than replenish. So we know that pandemics and humanitarian crises, whether environmental, but actually indeed, if we look at the amount of conflicts intra as well as international, and the amount that is being perpetuated of conflicts perpetuated by non-state actors, we are basically facing a confluence of humanitarian crises that is unfortunately looking to continue for some time. So in this kind of a context, if we have any remote knowledge of history, we know that these kinds of pandemics are either opportunities for communities to come together or to grow apart. It's not rocket science. Either communities come together or they grow apart. We know, we've been hearing now, build back better, right? Great, wonderful, terrific, absolutely have to do. What we like to argue at Religions for Peace, and those of us who are working with religious actors and secular actors would like to argue, it's build back together. Yeah, better is going to happen when it's together. It's build back together, which means that we have a moral, a financial, a political, a cultural obligation to work together across our divides, not only the religious divides, and heaven knows that that's complicated enough, but across the secular religious divides. We have, because of the pandemic, we actually have this as a sine qua non of emerging out of the pandemic as some form of cohesive environment, community. Otherwise, we will emerge as even more disparate, even more disconnected communities of humans, which will only feed us into a very vicious cycle of divisiveness rather than community. So, in fact, on the good side, we also know that religious institutions, religious NGOs, are at the forefront of the pandemic response because they are the top humanitarian actors out there. And because we know that governments around the world today are simply, most governments are simply unable to tend to every single need within their communities. We know this. Governments are struggling to be able to tend to the needs of their citizens, let alone the more than 75 million displaced people in the world today. 75 million displaced people in the world today. So frankly, we don't have a structure in place that can tend to all of this. So every hand on deck means that the religious actors, communities, NGOs have to be and are already in the first line of response. So we know that this is happening and that this is the case. What we now, the more sobering reality, is what we are learning within Religions for Peace. We set up something called the Multi-Religious Humanitarian Fund in April of 2020 to respond to the COVID pandemic, understanding full well that there are going to be multiple challenges that this pandemic brings about, but also understanding that religious institutions already have, some of them, extremely well-developed humanitarian arms. There are, like I said, they're at the forefront. So what are we trying to do? What we're trying to do is actually to encourage the religious institutions and religious NGOs who are providing humanitarian work to try to put a little bit of effort into working together so that the response is not what happened here already in April of 2020, where in Central Park in New York, one particular religious NGO of very high repute was compelled to build a ICU, an intensive care unit, where in the middle of Central Park, because they needed that space because hospitals were overflowing. So they set up an ICU unit and they did a very fine job. And they are known to be an incredible religiously inspired NGO. They were approached as they were putting this ICU unit, they were approached by two other religious NGOs from two other religious communities. And the two religious NGOs said, we'd like to help. We'd like to work with you and help and provide more and just work together. And what they were told was, we're good. We've got this. Thank you. Was that the right response, I wonder? I contend it is not the right response. I contend that this was an incredibly lost opportunity, not only to save more lives, not only to serve more people. It was a lost opportunity for social cohesion in this moment in time when this is the single most currency that we need as human beings, to come together, to work together. And what better way than when religious organizations come together? At a minimum, the subliminal message that is given to people that we can coexist regardless and in spite of our religious differences. Not only can we coexist, we can serve together. Serving is at the heart of almost every single faith tradition known to humankind. We have no excuse to be people of faith and not to serve. But nowhere in any faith tradition does it say you only have to serve your own. Nowhere in any faith tradition does it say you must serve as your own institution. You must make sure to safeguard the territoriality of your own institution as you serve. That is not anywhere in our faith scriptures or traditions. This is a human invention that we must safeguard our own institutional integrity as we serve. And therein is a fault line in the connection. Therein is that sobering element in the connection between religion and the pandemic. The pandemic is an opportunity, believe it or not, an opportunity for us to transcend our religious differences because we're each serving the same communities in the same countries who are suffering in the same way. It would have been, it should have been, it should still be an opportunity for us to work together, to serve together. Nobody's saying that every single humanitarian NGO has to now focus on just working with one another. That's not the point. The point is that you can at least try to devote, at least make a commitment, devote some of your resources, make a commitment that part of that serving of the communities as the first responders, you're going to do together. The response has been invariably from every single faith institution, barring one, and I will tell you which one in a second, but from every single faith institution whom I have gone to with a begging bowl and said, use the Multi-Religious Humanitarian Fund, make it your own, use it, even just make a commitment. Don't even put a penny there. Make a commitment that you're going to work in those countries that you're currently serving. Make a commitment you're going to work multi-religiously. The argument systematically has been, we don't have enough resources to devote to this. We've already got our own highly developed humanitarian infrastructure. We don't need to work with anybody else. We're doing fine. Thank you very much. Besides, comes the third argument. Do you know how difficult it is to manage this infrastructure as is in the middle of a pandemic? And you're saying we have to now work together to manage one? You must be joking. Actually, we're not joking. We're very, very, very serious. That this is the moment that we must endeavor to support one another's work. And herein comes that ultimate litmus test for any faith tradition, any faith institution, any faith actor. The litmus test is this. Nobody's questioning whether you're going to give or you're going to serve. What I am questioning is whether we're going to serve together and give to one another. So yes, it might be a Muslim organization that is going to give money to a Sunni one, to a Shia one, to a Christian Catholic one, to a Protestant, to a Orthodox, to a Jewish one, to a Hindu, to a Buddhist. Yes. Will we give of our own that has come from our communities, that is raised from our communities, that is raised by our communities, with the expectation that we will serve our communities and everybody else? Are we prepared to give to one another that which we value most dearly in the height of a pandemic, where people are dying in droves and where the very oxygen we breathe is at a premium? And the answer so far is no, we're not. We're not prepared. The only community that came through was a Buddhist community called the Risho Kosekai in Japan. They came through immediately and said, absolutely, here's a commitment, because they work like that. That is their work ethos. They have to serve everybody and they want to give to everyone who is in need. And that is the real litmus test of our faith traditions. Ultimately, that's the litmus test for whether religions are playing a role in this pandemic that is constructive, that is socially cohesive, that honors our respective faith tradition. Until today, we're still waiting to see that commitment that is made to give of your dearest and most valued and most highly treasured to other faith tradition, communities, institutions, serving everybody. Every single religious institution that is on the humanitarian front lines is serving everybody. I'm not telling you that Muslims are only serving Muslims, Lutherans are only serving Lutherans, Catholics are only serving. No. They're all serving everyone. The thing is, they're not serving one another and supporting one another to serve together. And that's where we have to go. So this is why the MultiFaith Global Vaccine Campaign is going to be launched, God willing, inshallah, next week, at the end of next week, on the 7th of October. And this will be the call to action for all religious actors to come together to not only serve together for the needs of, but actually really targeting this whole vaccine resistance that is on the rise, working together multi-religiously, because of course it's important for Muslim religious leaders to convince other Muslim religious leaders of why they may not be getting it and actually leading to the detriment and loss of life. Of course, it's important for Christian in their diversity to speak to other Christians, but it makes a very big difference when they all come together and speak as one. That's what Religions for Peace ultimately has been trying to do for the past 50 years and rather successfully doing. But this pandemic is a moment of truth. And we stand on the very precipice of whether we're actually going to honor, forget about anything else, whether we're going to honor our faith traditions or whether we're just going to honor our faith institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karam. That's I need to take a minute to digest. But yes, no, there is certainly a lot to consider and a lot that a lot of things that have now make some better sense to me, if that helps, of ways of seeing this the pandemic and the response to it. So now I'm going to invite questions from attendees. You can use the chat feature to submit questions, and we will answer them in turn. We include our panelists as well, if anybody has questions on the panel. Oh, okay, sorry, I have one from Yvonne Petrie. There we go. Okay. So do you find that there are similarities across religious communities of those who oppose vaccines? And if so, what are those similarities?
That's an excellent question. Yes, invariably, there are some of the discourses can be quite similar, whether it's a Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or Hindu, the odd leader. And it's always about violating the integrity of the human body and somehow interfering in what the divine intends and ordains, which, by the way, if we study the history of vaccines, we'll realize that these are not new arguments in any way, shape, or form. They're actually some of the oldest religiously inspired or religiously tinged arguments against science in general, but especially against vaccines. So this goes back a long, long way. No, we're interfering in the natural order of things, and we're going to pay. There's retribution that will happen at the end of this if we dare to do this. Ironically, thanks to the technological advancement that we're all living, so the technology that's being used is only adding to the level of that concern. Like, no, we're going to be putting chips into your body. They're going to be manipulating your body by I don't know what, but it's the same, inherently the same argument. And I think that's what makes it extremely interesting. So it's like you can't interfere with the divine ordinance, whatever that is. And so this vaccine is an interference, and that's basically, it comes down to that. Of course, there are many, many other arguments that proliferate, but it really does come down to that. Unfortunately, what we're seeing that perhaps was not so prevalent before, I don't know, because I wasn't alive when the polio vaccines came out, for instance, but what we're seeing now is an interesting tendency towards arguing from within the scientific community. So there are those within the scientific community who are also arguing against the vaccines, which has increased the, if you will, it's made it even more necessary for those who are religiously opposed to say, you see, these are the learned people, and they're saying the same thing. So that's not made things any easier, to be honest.
Okay, thanks. That actually leads to another question, and there are two that I think are very similar, basically suggesting the same thing. I'll read you the shorter one. What is a concrete way that local faith communities can come together to target the vaccine resistance? And Brenda had a similar sort of take on it. How can we understand or speak to organizations who are promoting anti-scientific, anti-vax rhetoric? So I think those are pretty much the same sort of question.
So the way we've seen the multi-religious pushback against the earlier arguments that were made against mass or public gatherings in religious, in temples and mosques and synagogues, etc. There was also a vocal community from within the religious spaces, which was saying, no, you have to attend, we have to do mass, we have to have this worship, etc. The lessons learned from the process of working there to try to confront some of that are going to be exactly the same lesson that we're having to use now as we look at the vaxxers, for lack of a better word, which is that you actually have to work on two levels. You have to work within your own religious communities to give more visibility and platform to the voices that are arguing from within the own religion. So the Muslims who are arguing against the Muslims, the Christians or Catholics who are arguing against. So you have to proceed internally within the religious community itself, find the voices that are speaking to the scientific evidence, the proof, etc., and using the religious arguments to do so. But the tipping point is when it's multi-religious leaders, institutions, and actors who are speaking together simultaneously with the scientific community. That is the tipping point that has worked in last year when we had the lockdown and people saying, no, you still have to go. This will work here too. And we're seeing some of that work in the United States already, where communities are working internally, but also multilaterally to speak out together. And we found that honestly, the young people and a lot of the women of faith in different communities have been very strong advocates, not only for being on the quote unquote right side or the scientific side, for lack of a better word, but they've been very strong advocates and practitioners of working together multilaterally. So we've seen that can actually make a tremendous difference. So in the Multi-Religious Humanitarian Fund, when we're looking at the way that some of this, for lack of a better word, the resistance to the resistance is taking place, we found that the front lines of this multi-religious, multilateral kind of collaboration, where even the youth of faith go and engage with business communities and finance some of these efforts, we've seen that it's been the young people and the women who are at the forefront of this space. So I think those are very interesting and very critical tipping points in that space.
Okay, thank you. I've got an easy one now. How can one get the various religious organizations to overcome their fear of each other?
That's very simple. So tried and tested practice. It's Religions for Peace is a brilliant example for this. I'm not just saying that because it's the institution that I happen to serve. Truly, it's been 50 years of multi-religious work over all continents and addressing a gazillion and one issues. The challenge is already being overcome. The examples of successful multi-religious engagement from the very, very local community level to the global level, there are examples. That's why we have interreligious councils with a legacy. Think anti-apartheid activism in South Africa. This was a hugely multi-religious, multi-civil engagement. It worked. It served its purpose. Some of the religious leaders who were such active anti-apartheid actors have long been what's the word in English? Absorbed into the new government positions in different spaces. This is a very alive example. We don't have to go so far back in history. Here in the United States of America, the civil rights movement was able to be a successful movement. Yes, of course, there are hiccups. I know. I'm not saying it's the best thing ever, but it was a civil rights movement. Martin Luther King was not just a reverend. Martin Luther King was a civil rights leader. And he was listened to and admired and respected, and ultimately because he was a civil rights leader. So we have examples of multi-religious activism for rights, for human rights. It's not that it's never happened before. It's just that history is structured by the victors in the Western Hemisphere because they're the ones with a lot more money. And the victors in the Western Hemisphere have tended to be rather secular. So when they write history, they conveniently ignore a few things in the process. And it seems as if it's really just the secular influence that seems to work, when in fact not. In fact, not. In most parts of the world, the most active civil rights related dynamics, liberation theology, Latin America, there's a history of multi-religious collaboration that just doesn't get documented as such because we lose it. It gets mired in the overall secular institutions and secular lingo. But it's been there. It's happening every day. And no human rights movement has been successful anywhere in the world without the engagement, not just of one religious community. Then it wouldn't have worked. but the engagement of every single religious actor in that community. In India today, if we look at the pushback against Hindu nationalism, it's not just happening by Muslims. It's by Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Christians. They have a joint interest and they're working with human rights groups. So it's multi-religious, multilateral. That is happening every day. We breathe it. We just don't always see it.
All right. We're going to switch gears a bit because we have a question that says, tell us more about the MultiFaith vaccine initiative.
So the basic premise of this MultiFaith vaccine initiative is that religious leaders, religious institutions, and religious NGOs work together with their secular counterparts in specific countries where there is an anticipated resistance, but where there is also the little light that says that they might actually have access to the vaccines, because there's no point in combating vaccine resistance if we don't even know if they're going to get the vaccine in the first place. So we're looking at the countries where we understand there are already vaccines, and there is an active vaccine resistance. And the idea is precisely to activate the multi-religious, multilateral partnerships in those spaces and build on existing success in working on transmitting the scientific messages from the COVID outbreak, because we already have worked multi-religiously, multilaterally to try to push forward a framework of here's the right messages, guys, that you need to keep in mind. We're going to use those same places, those same kinds of alliances to direct an alliance that is multi-religious and multilateral, dealing with issue after issue of resistance. That's the basic idea.
Okay, good, thanks. I've got two more that have come in. Are you good to go? We have a couple more, and then there's a third one that is rather long, but may not be a long answer. And I think then we'll probably end it there. But I want to make sure we get to everyone's questions. So this is the one from Roger Petrie. What would you see as the key strengths, capacities of religions to innovate in the ways of doing development, especially for achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals in the context of the pandemic?
Number one, the Sustainable Development Goals are not the United Nations Development Goals. They were brokered by the United Nations. These are 193 nations goals. And that's what makes them so incredible, is that you don't usually get one government to agree on anything. So when you get 193 to agree on something, that makes it really special. The oldest social service providers, the oldest human development actors are actually the religious institutions. So it's not the innovation is already in place, because these institutions today are still targeting millions of people through their work. Reverend Dr. Curran is right here leading one of them. They work already. They're already service providers. The challenge is not whether you can get innovations within the religions to serve the Sustainable Development Goals. The challenge is, can you actually track what is already happening by these different religious actors to serve these goals long before the goals were even thought of and agreed by the governments? Can we actually track that? That's why in Religions for Peace, when we were thinking of our new strategic plan from 2020 to 2025, the basic premise was this: we don't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of what the religious organizations need to do with one another and have been doing for the last umpteen years. What we do need to do is be much more diligent in tracking how that multi-religious collaboration is indeed supporting. So how could we use the same measurements that governments themselves are going to use, the same indicators that governments themselves are going to use to track their Sustainable Development Goal achievement, but use it now with multi-religious actors and collaboration to track, so that you can actually go to a government, to a Ministry of Finance, to your Ministry of Statistics and say, here is how this multi-religious collaboration on areas A, B, C, D actually fulfills this indicator that you're now going to go and say is our achievement as country X. You can now see how your multi-religious collaborative actors have actually sustained it. So we needed within the religious communities to slightly adjust our language so that we're actually speaking Sustainable Development Goals, indicators, and agendas. We speak it anyway, just in different ways. But now we're going to try to speak it much more strategically so that it's much more clearly targeted. So the issue is not whether they can innovate and deliver. The issue is how can the secular paradigms of governance actually track and accept the community commitment contribution of not just religions, because I don't want a much more powerful Sunnah or Shia or Catholic or Protestant entity. Thank you very much. I would like to see a much more powerful multi-religious, collaborative, service-oriented reality. So how can we make sure that we can get this multi-religious work and collaboration to be accepted by governments as part of their measurement and indices, and then shared? That is the challenge. And that's up to us within our faith communities, but it's also up to the way that we work with our secular counterparts. The more multilateral the partnerships that we're doing, the pandemic offers us an opportunity. It offers us an opportunity to showcase exactly how we're working together and how we're not, but exactly how we're working together to target the pandemic's own needs. We have an opportunity, believe it or not.
Okay, so what is this is from an anonymous attendee. What is the role for persons who have no religious beliefs working or living with all those religious constitutions and believers during the pandemic?
You don't have to work with your religious belief just as long as you work collaboratively. There are so many different ways of living as a person of faith. Of course, you have the religious institution, but you also have religious NGOs. You have human rights NGOs, which are religiously inspired. You have human rights actors who are multi-religiously inspired. There's plenty of ways to engage. I'm not saying the whole world has to be religion. I'm saying we need to, just as religious actors, work better together, which also means we have to work multilaterally, which also means we have to engage those of no belief whatsoever, but who are committed to a human rights agenda and the welfare of all. Plenty of space to collaborate. It's not as if secular actors are doing a very good job of partnering. Hey, look at the United Nations, look at the governments of the world. Are we doing a very good job of partnering in there? No, we are not. So guess what? It isn't about suddenly emulating the secular paradigm. No, it's about insisting on working together to serve one another beyond our own parameters of comfort.
Okay, and the final question, if you're up for one final one. Okay, okay, I'll read this. I'm going to condense it a little bit because I think it might be a little clearer. There was a comment, Dr. Karam, great lecture. I admire your passion, and I can say that personally as well. So the question is, how can faith-based NGOs best collaborate to get healthcare and humanitarian aid and support to countries such as Cuba and Haiti, so countries in our own North American backyard, when the USA has an embargo against such countries and economic migrants are being deported, and at the same time, when provinces like Saskatchewan and Alberta are having their healthcare systems pushed to the point of requesting federal government and military support because they are overrun with, with their own COVID cases.
Great question.
Clear? Okay.
Yeah, it is. And thank you so much for the question and for articulating it. This is a fantastic question to legitimize two things. Why it's important to work transnationally and multi-religiously. What we know about a number of humanitarian organizations is that they don't just work in one country, they work usually transnationally. Religious humanitarian actors do exactly the same. They work everywhere. So if something seems to be stuck in a particular nation, that should not impede the global counterparts or the ones who are working globally or transnationally from being able to provide support to those very same actors who need the support. So yes, Cuba is in the backyard, but Cuba is, there is a embargo. Fine. We don't have to do it from Canada. It can be done from Europe. It can be done from Latin America, other Latin American countries, right in their own backyard. There's Lutheran World right there. Reverend Dr. Curran, her federation exists in so many different countries. We have a situation with Myanmar where it's almost impossible to get support from or resources delivered from the Western Hemisphere, for lack of a better word. Okay, so it doesn't matter. There are regional actors in that space who are acceptable to the government itself, which is currently not accepting many people. But there are regional pressure points. We look at Afghanistan, we realize, maybe we can't do it through the United States, maybe we cannot do it through Europe, but guess what? Regionally, neighbors can. And the beauty of multilateral, multi-religious is that you can actually circumvent these kinds of national boundaries, which is why many governments sometimes make things very difficult, because they understand the power of that transnational connectivity. And it's not to challenge governments in any way, shape, or form, but to activate the other pressure points and spots, which can still nevertheless deliver the aid to those people who have it in need. It doesn't have to come from one country. In fact, quite frankly, it probably shouldn't come from just one country.
Okay, thank you. That's it was wonderful. I'm going to call on Brenda Anderson now to wrap up and say a few words of thanks and kind of round out this extremely interesting and informative last hour.
Thank you, Noel. And thank you, Dr. Karam. At a time when we may be swayed by media to view religion as a purely divisive force, and when populism combines vague rhetorical religious sentiment to substantiate its political goals of isolationism and casting chaos for opportunity's sake, your words are needed to remind us of the historical veracity of multi-religious work. We have heard your challenge. To learn about your largest multi-religious organization and to hear the caliber and vision of those involved is really inspirational, and it calls on us to do our part here in Regina and elsewhere. Your clarion call that now more than ever we need to engage in bridge building, allyship amongst and between all religions and between all communities, regardless of faith or creed, has been heard. Our survival relies on caring for one another, and surely that's the baseline in all religious and humanist teachings. There is a role for each of us to play in these sobering times, and therein, I believe, lies the hope you speak of. It is with us. So Dr. Karam, on behalf of the Planning Committee and the audience this evening, please accept our very sincere gratitude for lighting a fire under us, for grounding us in truths and lifting us up in your tangible hope. It is a challenge to build back together. Thank you very much.